ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्यं नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरये। नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवती उत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी। मुखं करोति वाचालं पङ्गुं लङ्घयते गिरिं यत्कृपातमः वन्दे श्रीपुरन्दीनतारिणं परमानन्दमाधवं श्रीचैतन्य ईश्वरं तस्मात् नमो विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिचारुशान्तिरामेश्वरं प्रभुपाद प्रणमामि। हरे कृष्णा। तो we are going to reading Srimad Bhagavatam, third canto, 31 chapter, Lord Kapila's instructions on the movements of the living entities. So we are reading from text 1. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Karmana netrena janturdeha pattaye striya pravista udaram pumsareta kanasraya. Translation: the personality of Godhead said, under the supervision of the Supreme Lord and according to the result of his work, the living entity, the soul, is made to enter into the womb of a woman through the particle of male semen to assume a particular type of body, purport. As stated in the last chapter, after suffering different kinds of hellish conditions, a man comes again to the human form of body. The same topic is continued in this chapter in order to give a particular type of human form to a person who has already suffered hellish life. The soul is transferred to the semen of a man who is just suitable to become his father. During sexual intercourse, the soul is transferred through the semen of the father into the mother's womb in order to produce a particular type of body. This process is applicable to all embodied living entities, but it is especially mentioned for the man who was transferred to the Andhra hill. After suffering there, when he who has had many types of hellish bodies, like those of dogs and hogs, is to come again to the human form, he is given the charge to take his birth in the same type of body from which he degraded himself to hell. Everything is done by the supervision of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Material nature supplies the body, but it does so under the direction of the Super Soul. It is said in Bhagavad Gita that a living entity is wandering in this material world on a chariot made by material nature. The Supreme Lord, as Super Soul, is always present with the individual soul. He directs material nature to supply a particular type of body to the individual soul according to the result of his work, and the material nature supplies it. Here, one word, Reta Kanasraya, is very significant because it indicates that it is not the semen of the man that creates life within the womb of a woman. Rather, the living entity, the soul, takes shelter in a particular particle of semen and is then pushed into the womb of a woman. Then the body develops. There is no possibility of creating a living entity without the presence of the soul simply by sexual intercourse. The materialistic theory that there is no soul and that a child is born simply by material combination of the sperm and ovum is not very feasible. It is unacceptable. Slok 3.31.2. काललं तव एकारात्रेण पञ्चरात्रेण बुद्बुदं दाशहेन तु करकन्धौ पेशी andam bhatata param. Translation: on the first night, the sperm and ovum mix, and on the fifth night, the mixture ferments into a bubble. On the 10th night, it develops into a form like a plum, and after that, it gradually turns into a lump of flesh or an egg, as the case may be. Purport: the body of the soul develops in four different ways according to its different sources. One kind of body, that of the trees and plants, sprouts from the earth. The second kind of body grows from perspiration, was with as with flies, germs, and bugs. The third kind of body develops from eggs, and the fourth develops from an embryo. This verse indicates that after emulsification of the ovum and sperm, the body gradually develops either into a lump or flesh or into an egg, as the case may be. In the case of birds, it develops into an egg, and in the case of animals and human beings, it develops into a lump of flesh. Srimad Bhagavatam 3.31.3 Masena tu shirodavhyam bahbha angri adi anga vigraha. Other limbs take shape. By the end of 3 months, the nails, fingers, toes, body hair, bones, and skin appear, as do the organ of generation and the other apertures in the body, namely the eyes, nostrils, ears, mouth, and anus. 3.31.4 चतुर्भिर्धतवा सप्ता पंचभिक्षुत्रिद उद्भवा शब्द सद्भिर्जरायुना वीता कुक्षौ भ्रम्यति दक्षिणे. Translation: within 4 months from the date of conception, the seven essential ingredients of the body, namely chicle, blood, flesh, fat, bone, marrow, and semen, come into existence. At the end of 5 months, hunger and thirst make themselves felt, and at the end of 6 months, the fetus enclosed by the amnion begins to move on the right side of the abdomen. Purport: when the body of the child is completely formed at the end of 6 months, the child, if he is male, begins to move on the right side, and if female, she tries to move on the left side. 3.31.5 Matur Jagdhanna Panadyar Idhad Dhatur Asammate Shetevin Mutrayor Garte Sajanturjantu Sambhave. Translation: deriving its nutrition from the food and drink taken by the mother, the fetus grows and remains in that abominable residence of stools and urine, which is the breeding place of all kinds of worms. Purport: in the Markandeya Purana, it is said that in the intestine of the mother, the umbilical cord, which is known as Apiyan, uh, Apyayani, joins the mother to the abdomen of the child, and through this passage, the child within the womb accepts the mother's assimilated foodstuff. In this way, the child is fed by the mother's intestine within the womb and grows from day to day. The statement of the Markandeya Purana about the child's situation within the womb is exactly corroborated by modern medical science, and thus the authority of the Puranas cannot be disproved, as is sometimes attempted by the Mayavadi philosophers. Since the child depends completely on the assimilated foodstuff of the mother, during pregnancy there are restrictions on the food taken by the mother. Too much salt, chili, onion, and similar food is forbidden for the pregnant mother because the child's body is too delicate and new for him to tolerate such pungent food. Restrictions and precautions to be taken by the pregnant mother, as enunciated in the Smriti scriptures of Vedic literature, are very useful. We can understand from the Vedic literature how much care is taken to beget a nice child in society. The Garbhadhana ceremony before sexual intercourse was compulsory for persons in the higher grades of society, and it is very scientific. Other processes recommended in the Vedic literature during pregnancy are also very important. To take care of the child is the primary duty of the parents, because if such care is taken, society will be filled with good population to maintain the peace and prosperity of the society, country, and human race. Slok 3.31.6. कृमिभिः शता सर्वङ्गा सौकुमारात् प्रतीक्षणं मूर्छम् अपनोति उरुक्लेशास् तत्र तया शुद्धिर्मुहुः. Translation: bitten again and again all over the body by the hungry worms in the abdomen itself, the child suffers terrible agony because of his tenderness. He thus becomes unconscious moment after moment because of the terrible condition. Purport: the miserable condition of the material existence is not only felt when we come out of the womb of the mother, but is also present within the womb. Miserable life begins from the moment the living entity begins to contact his material body. Unfortunately, we forget this experience and do not take the miseries of birth very seriously. In Bhagavad Gita, therefore, it is specifically mentioned that one should be very alert to understand the specific difficulties of birth and death. Just as during the formation of this body, we have to pass through so many difficulties within the womb of the mother, at the time of death, there are also many difficulties. As described in the previous chapter, one has to transmigrate from one body to another, and the transmigration into the bodies of dogs and hogs is especially miserable. But despite such miserable conditions, due to the spell of Maya, we forget everything and become enamored by the present so called happiness, which is described as actually no more than a counteraction to distress. 3.31.7. कतु तीक्ष्णो कतु तीक्ष्णोष्णलाभाना रुक्षं लबि लुक रुक्षं लदिभिरुल्बनै मातिर्भूक् तैर् उपस्पृष्टा सर्वान् सर्वान् गोत्थिता वेदाना. Translation: owing to the mother's eating bitter, pungent foodstuffs or food which is too salty or too sour, the body of the child incessantly suffers pains which are almost intolerable. Purport: all descriptions of the child's bodily situation in the womb of the mother are beyond our conception. It is very difficult to remain in such a position, but still the child has to remain because his consciousness is not very developed. The child can tolerate it. Otherwise, he would die. That is the benediction of Maya, who endows the suffering body with the qualifications for tolerating such terrible tortures. 3.31.8. Ulbina samvritistasmin antraischa vahir aste kritva shira kakshu kuksau bhugna prishta shirodhara. Translation: placed within the amnion and covered outside by the intestines, the child remains lying on one side of the abdomen, his head turned towards his belly and his back and neck arched like a bow. Purport: if a grown man were put into such a condition as a child, within the abdomen, completely entangled in all respects, it would be impossible for him to live even for a few seconds. Unfortunately, we forget all the sufferings and try to be happy in this life, not caring for the liberation of the soul from the entanglement of birth and death. It is an unfortunate civilization in which these matters are not plainly discussed to make people understand the precarious condition of material existence. 3.31.9 अकल्पस्वङ्गचेष्टायां शकुन्ता इव पञ्जरे तत्र लब्धा स्मृतिर्दैवात् कर्मजन्मा शतो बहं शतो बभम् स्मरन् दीर्घम् अनुच्युत अनुच वशं शर्मा किं नम विन्दते. Translation: the child thus remains just like a bird in a cage without freedom of movement. At that time, if the child is fortunate, he can remember all the troubles of his past 100 births, and he grieves wretchedly what is the possibility of peace of mind in that condition. Purport: after birth, the child may forget about the difficulties of his past lives, but when we are grown up, we can at least understand the grievous tortures undergone at birth and death by reading the authorized scriptures like Srimad Bhagavatam. If we do not believe in the scriptures, that is a different question. But if we have faith in the authority of such descriptions, then we must prepare for our freedom in the next life. That is possible in this human form of life. One who does not take heed of these indications of suffering in human existence is said to be undoubtedly committing suicide. It is said that this human form of life is the only means of crossing over the nescience of Maya or material existence. We have a very efficient boat in this human form of body, and there is a very expert captain, the spiritual master. The scriptural injunctions are like favorable winds. If we do not cross over the ocean of the nescience of material existence, in spite of all these facilities, then certainly we are all intentionally committing suicide. 3.31.10 आरभ्य सप्तमान् लब्धा बोधो विवेविता नैका नैकात्रस्तेषु तीर्वातैर्विस्तहुरिव शोधरा. Translation: thus endowed with the development of consciousness from the seventh month after his conception, the child is tossed downward by the ears that press like embryo during the weeks preceding delivery. Like the worms born of the same fill the abominable cavity, he cannot remain in one place. Purport: at the end of the seventh month, the child is moved by the bodily ear and does not remain in the same place, for the entire uterine system becomes slackened before delivery. The worms have been described here as Shodara. Shodara means born of the same mother, since the child is born from the womb of the mother, and the worms are also born of fermentation within the womb of the same mother. Under the circumstances, the child and the worms are actually brothers. We are very anxious to establish universal brotherhood among human beings, but we should take into consideration that even the worms are our brothers. What to speak of other living entities? Therefore, we should be concerned about all living entities. 3.31.11 Nathamana Rishirvita Saptavadrai Kritanjali Sturbhitatam Vikalvaya Vachayeno Dare Ripita. Translation: the living entity is this rightful condition of life, bound by seventh layer of material ingredients. Prayer with folded hands appealing to the Lord who has put him in that condition. But it is said that when a woman is having labor pains, she promises that she will never again become pregnant and suffer from such a severely painful condition. Similarly, when one is undergoing some surgical operation, he promises that he will never again act in such a way as to become diseased and have to undergo medical surgery. Or when one falls into danger, he promises that he will never again make the same mistake. Similarly, the living entity, when put into a hellish condition of life, prays to the Lord that he will never again commit sinful activities and have to be put into the womb for repeated birth and death. In the hellish condition within the womb, the living entity is very much afraid of being born again. But when he is out of the womb, when he is in the full life and good health, he forgets everything and commits again and again the same sins for which he was put into that horrible condition of existence. 3.31.12 Janturvacha तस्यो तस्योपासनम् अवितुं तस्योपासनम् अवितुं जगत् इच्छायत्या नानातनुर्भुविचलच् चरणारविन्दम् सोऽहं व्रजामि शरणं है अकुतो भयं मे येन येन दृशि गतिरदर्शि असतो अनुरूपा. Translation: the human soul says, I take shelter of the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who appears in his various eternal forms and works on the surface of the world. I take shelter of him only because he can give me relief from all fear, and from him I have received this condition of life, which is just befitting my impious activities. Purport: the word Chalach Charnara Vindam refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead who actually works or travels upon the surface of the world. For example, Lord Ramchandra actually walked on the surface of the world, and Lord Krishna also walked just like an ordinary man. The prayer is therefore offered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead who descends to the surface of this earth or any part of this universe for the protection of the pious and the destruction of the impious. It is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita that when there is an increase of irreligion and discrepancies arise in the real religion activities, the Supreme Lord comes to protect the pious and kill the impious. This verse indicates Lord Krishna. Another significant point is this verse is that the Lord comes ichhaya by his own will. As Krishna confirms in Bhagavad Gita, Sambhavami Atma Mayaya, I appear at my will by my internal potency. He is not forced to come by the laws of material nature. It is stated here, Ichhaya, it does not assume any form as an impersonalist thing because he comes at his own will and the form in which he descends in his eternal form, as the Supreme Lord puts the living entity into the condition of horrible existence. He can also deliver him, and therefore one should seek shelter at the lotus feet of Krishna. Krishna demands, give up everything and surrender unto me. And it is also said in Bhagavad Gita that anyone who approaches him does not come back again to accept a form in material existence, but goes back to Godhead, back to home, never to return. 3.31.13 यस्तव अत्र बद्धा इव कर्मभिरवृतात्मा भूतेन्द्रियाशयमयम् अवलम्ब्य मायम् अस्ते विशुद्धम् अविकरम् अखण्डबोद्धम् अत अत पया मन हृदये वसितं नमामि. Translation: I, the pure soul, appearing now, bound by my activities, am lying in the womb of my mother by the arrangement of Maya. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him who is also here with me, but who is unaffected and unchangeless. He is unlimited, but he is perceived in the repentant heart. To him I offer my respectful obeisances. Purport: as stated in the previous verse, the Jiva soul says, I take shelter of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, constitutionally, the Jiva soul is the subordinate servitor of the Supreme Soul, the personality of Godhead. Both the Supreme Soul and the Jiva soul are sitting in the same body, as confirmed in the Upanishads. They are sitting as friends, but one is suffering and the other is aloof from suffering. In the verse, in the verse, it is stated Vishuddham, Vishuddham, Abhikaram, Akhanda Bodham. The Super Soul is always sitting apart from all contamination. The living entity is contaminated and suffering because he has a material body, but that does not mean that because the Lord is also with him, he also has a material body. He is Avikaram, changeless. He is always the same supreme. But unfortunately, the Mayavadi philosophers, because of their impure hearts, cannot understand that the supreme soul, the super soul, is different from the individual soul. It is said there, Atapyam mana hridaye vasitam. He is in the heart of every living entity. But he can be realized only by a soul who is repentant. The individual soul becomes repentant that he forgot his constitutional position, wanted to become one with the supreme soul and tried his best to lord it over material nature. He has been baffled and therefore he is repentant. At that time, super soul or the relationship between the super soul and the individual soul is realized. As it is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, after many births, the knowledge comes to the conditioned soul that Vasudeva is great, his master and his lord. The individual soul is the servant, and therefore he surrenders unto him. At that time, he becomes a Mahatma, a great soul. Therefore, a fortunate living being who comes to this understanding, even within the womb of his mother, has his liberation assured. यपंचभूता रजिते रहिता शरीरे छन्नो यतीन्द्रिया गुणर्थचिद आत्मा को हम तेना विकुंठा महिमानं ऋषिं तम एनं वन्दे परम प्रकृति पुरुषाय पुमंसम्. Translation: I am separated from the Supreme Lord because of my being in this material body, which is made of five elements, and therefore my qualities and senses are being misused, although I am essentially spiritual. Because the Supreme Personality of Godhead is transcendental to material nature and the living entity, because he is devoid of such a material body, and because he is always glorious in his spiritual qualities, I offer my obeisances unto him. Purport. The difference between the living entity and the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that the living entity is prone to be subjected to material nature, whereas the Supreme Godhead is always transcendental to material nature as well as to the living entities. When the living entity is put into material nature, then his senses are, and qualities are polluted or designated. There is no possibility for the Supreme Lord to become embodied, embodied by material qualities or material senses. For he is above the influence of material nature and cannot possibly be put in the darkness of ignorance like the living entities. Because of his full knowledge, he is never subjected to the influence of material nature. Material nature is always under his control, and it is therefore not possible the material nature can control the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Since the identity of the living entity is very minute, he is prone to be subjected to material nature. But when he is freed from his material body, which is false, he attains the same spiritual nature as the Supreme Lord. At that time, there is no qualitative difference between him and the Supreme Lord. But because he is not so quantitatively powerful as to never be put under the influence of material nature, he is quantitatively different from the Lord. The entire process of devotional service is to purify oneself of this contamination of material nature and put oneself on the spiritual platform, where he is qualitatively one with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the Vedas, it is said that the living entity is always free. Asango hai ayam purusha, the living entity is liberated. His material contamination is temporary, and his actual position is that he is liberated. This liberation is achieved by Krishna consciousness, which begins from the point of surrender. Therefore, it is said here, I offer my respectful obeisances unto the Supreme Person. 3.31.15. यन्मया यरुगुणा कर्मा निबन्धनेऽस्मिन् संसरिके पथि चरंस्तद् अभिश्रामिना नष्टस्मृति पुनरयं प्रवीर्णिता लोकं युक्तया काया महद् अनुग्रहाम् अंतरेण. Translation. The human soul further prays the living entity is put under the influence of material nature and continues a hard struggle for existence on a path of repeated birth and death. This conditional life is due to his forgetfulness of his relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, without the Lord's mercy, how can he again engage in the transcendental loving service of the Lord? Purport. The Mayavadi philosopher says that simply by cultivation of knowledge by mental speculation, one can be liberated from the condition of material bondage. But here it is said one is liberated not by knowledge, but by the mercy of the Supreme Lord. The knowledge the conditioned soul against by mental speculation. the knowledge the conditioned soul gains by mental speculation, however powerful it may be, is always too imperfect to approach the absolute truth. It is said that without the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one cannot understand him or his actual form, quality, and name. Those who are not in devotional service go on speculating for many thousands of years, but they are still unable to understand the nature of the absolute truth. One can be liberated in the knowledge of the absolute truth simply by the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is clearly said herein that our memory is lost because we are now covered by his material energy. Arguments may be put forward as to why we have been put under the influence of this material energy by the supreme will of the Lord. This is explained in Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says, I am sitting in everyone's heart, and due to me, one is forgetful or one is alive in knowledge. The forgetfulness of the conditioned soul become is also due to the direction of the Supreme Lord. A living entity misuse his little independence and he wants to lord it over material nature. This misuse of independence, which is called Maya, is always available. Otherwise, there would be no independence. Independence implies is that one can use it properly or improperly. It is not static, it is dynamic. Therefore, misuse of independence is the cause of being influenced by Maya. Maya is so strong that the Lord says that it is very difficult to surmount her influence, but one can do so very easily if he surrenders unto me. Mam eva je prapaddante. Anyone who surrenders unto him can overcome the influence of the stringent laws of material nature. It is clearly said here that a living entity is put under the influence of Maya by his will. And if anyone wants to get out of this entanglement, this can be made possible simply by his mercy. The activities of the conditioned souls under the influence of material nature are explained here. Every conditioned soul is engaged in different types of work under the influence of material nature. We can see in the material world that the conditioned soul acts so powerfully, mm, that he is playing wonderfully in creating the so-called advancement of material civilization for sense gratification. But actually his position is to know that he is an eternal servant of the Supreme Lord. Why he is actually in perfect knowledge? When he is actually in perfect knowledge, he knows that the Lord is the supreme worshipful object and that the living entity is his eternal servant. Without this knowledge, the engages in material activities, that is called ignorance. So we stop here our reading. Next day we will continue the reading. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. जगत गुरु शिल प्रभुपाद की जय, पति पावन शिल गुरु महाराज की जय, अनंत कोटि वैष्णव भक्तवृंद की जय। जय निताय।